Naham tishtami vaikunte yoginam hridayena cha madbhakta yatra gayanti tatra tishtami narada. O Narada, I do not dwell in Vaikunta or even in the heart of the yogi. Wherever my devotees sing my praises, there do I dwell. Good morning, everyone. Our topic this morning is preparing the heart for devotion. I chose this verse because this is the verse that was given by Swami Bhuteshananda in his lecture on this topic. This topic is really taken from one of the talks that Swami Bhuteshananda gave. It's found two places, one in the original Bengali. There's a very nice book, I've referred to it many, many times, Sri Ramakrishna Bhava Prabha. And it's found there under the title, Shuddha Bhakti Lokhon Otar Prapti Rupai. And it's also in the English equivalent book. It's not a translation of all of the essays, and it has some that aren't in the original Bengali, called Supreme Devotion and the Way to Attain It. No, I'm sorry, that's the English version is called The Uniqueness of the Ramakrishna Incarnation and Other Essays. But this particular talk that he gave, Shuddha Bhakti Lakon, in the English it's called Supreme Devotion and the Way to Attain It, is a very beautiful talk and very important. And since I've run out of original ideas myself, I thought I would just go through and give a little bit of a summary of what we find in this lecture. Swami Bhuteshananda was, for those of you who never had the chance to meet him, he was a very wonderful soul. He was the 12th president of the Ramakrishna Order, and a very really unique blend of very sweet personality with a tremendous scholarship and a wonderful sense of humor. He had all of these things. And his scholarship, he was very devotional in nature, but his scholarship was also with Advaita Vedanta. He was a master of the Upanishads, but also Bhagavata Purana. This verse that he begins with is from the Bhagavata, that this is Vishnu Narayana talking to Narada about the importance of the path of devotion. So I wanted to go through some of the ideas that we find in this particular essay, or it's really a lecture that it reads like an essay. He was such a brilliant speaker that they said when they transcribed his talks that they didn't have to edit it at all. There was just no buts and ands in it, and the way we always do, and make extra words and things. It was perfectly smooth. He was a very simple person, but so deep. I had the privilege of having my brahmacharya vows and sannyasa vows from him. And I got to spend a little time with him, not very close personal time. But when we would go in the mornings, all the sannyasis and brahmacharis go for pranam in the morning. People from outside would wonder what's happening. They'd hear roaring laughter. They're very often going for pranam, you go, you make pranam, and you leave. But all the sadhus would wait there, and he would ask for questions. He loved questions. And he was so simple and had such a wonderful sense of humor that everyone would be roaring with laughter. So this was anyhow Swami Bhuteshananda. So if we have to sum up the essence of this talk in today's lecture, it'll be a statement that Sri Ramakrishna makes very often. And it's a statement that comes in two parts. Most of the time, he only gives the first part, and most of the time, we only think of the first part. The first part is he says that Bhakti Pot Shohoj Pot, the path of devotion is a simple path. And he means this word Shohoj, Sahaja. It's a very interesting word. It means simple, it means natural. And something that we all can do. It's natural to us. Because we all know what it means to love someone. We know what it means to have a relationship. That very often the path of devotion is based on one of the different bhavas. We know what it's like as a child to love a mother. We know what it's like to have a dear friend, all of these things. So it's very natural to us, and we utilize all of these different emotions that we have. But the second part is, so Thakur say, Bhakti pa chahoj pa, tobe ato shohoj noi. But not so easy. It's not so simple. And this whole talk is about how do we prepare ourselves for this path of devotion. Prastuti, he uses this term, that we have to have certain preparations, prerequisites, however we want to understand it, if we want to really make progress on the path of devotion. We may say that from a relative point of view, compared to Jnana Yoga and compared to Raja Yoga, definitely simple, definitely much easier. This Jnana Yoga, it really requires tremendous amount of dispassion, detachment from the world, the feeling that nothing is so real, that some burning renunciation within, and no attachment to anything. It's very difficult. Plus, a long period of study. We know, we read Brahma Sutra, that in the very beginning, it's understood that someone has to read all of the Upanishads and all of the scriptures and everything to really be prepared for that. Raja Yoga, equally so, we have to have tremendous self-control over the body, mind, senses, and everything if we want to really practice Raja Yoga. So from that point of view, the Bhakti Yoga is relatively simple because it's open to everyone. There are no prerequisites that way, that we have to finish some course of study, we have to go through our brahmacharya period or anything like that. It's not restricted to anything, to even the type of life that we lead. We can be what other people will say are very sinful types of people, huh? And still, through this path, following the path of devotion, we can have a tremendous transformation in our lives. So I want to begin with making a little distinction, important distinction between adhikara. A lot of what we've been talking about is adhikara, that who is qualified for a particular path. Adhikara and prastuti, and this preparation. So we have this doctrine, Adhikara. This is a doctrine that we're qualified, or we have the right or privilege somehow to follow a particular spiritual path based on our own personality, on our own nature, maybe family tradition, all sorts of different things, our philosophical understanding, our view of the world, all different reasons that will be attracted to a particular path. And sometimes it'll be a very strict thing, that you live with a teacher, with a guru in the forest for 12 years and do all of that study. And in the old days, it was very restricted. That means that you had to be born in a certain caste and gender, restricted generally to boys and to Brahmin boys, that they were the only ones who were allowed to do that. So it was a little bit restricted. When Sri Ramakrishna talks about it, it's more this idea of what works for us. So it has nothing to do with caste or gender or anything like that. So it's this question of adhikara, which it makes it a little restrictive for the path of Jnana Yoga and Raja Yoga, that we really do have to have a certain amount of scriptural study and background and things like that, and certainly a certain amount of detachment from the world, especially for this Jnana Yoga. If we go about saying, I am Brahman, and this whole I is centered in the body with all desires and things and everything, we'll make a mess of it. So that has to be something that's there at the very beginning. So now the question of Bhakti Yoga is quite different. There are no prerequisites in that sense. There's no adhikara. Everyone is qualified, open to everyone. No one is an outcast. No one is debarred from this path of devotion. Everybody's birthright. Even the most sinful people. We have a nice verse from this Gita. Apichet sudaracharo. Even if someone is a very horrible person, does nasty things, suduracharo, Bhajate mam ananya bhak. If he worships me, Krishna is saying to Arjuna, if he worships me with unswerving devotion, sadhureva samantavyaha, he should be considered to be a holy person, a good person, sadhu. Why? Samyak vyavasito hisaha, because he's decided to turn his life around. So this is a wonderful thing about bhakti yoga. Well, anybody can do it. All we need is some sincere desire to change ourselves, to develop this devotion, this love of God, and to really cultivate that love and devotion within our hearts. So this is his adhikara. It's open to everyone. Prastuti is a different question. It may be open to everyone, but we won't all necessarily get the fruits of our spiritual practice unless there's some preparation. So this is a very important thing. Let me give an example of this distinction. Some people, many of our devotees, they'll live in these communities like Leisure World or Rider World. What is it called? Rider World? Yeah. Where just by living there, you have the right to a certain plot of land. They'll have some community garden, and anybody who lives there can take that, and they can grow flowers or they can grow vegetables, and it's their right. They don't have to ask anybody. They don't have to apply or anything. It's a given. They're allowed to do that. But if they don't pull the weeds, if they don't fertilize, they don't do anything, they just plant some things there, and they don't water it, they won't get any crop. So that's prastuti. That's the difference. The path of bhakti yoga is open to all of us, but if we want to get a good crop, then we really have to think of how do we prepare the field, how do we prepare the ground, and it's an ongoing process. We have to keep weeding, we have to keep watering and everything. So this is the crux of the talk that Swami Bhuteshananda gave. How do we prepare the ground for this path of devotion? So now we see that when he says Ato Sahajana, it is but it is not so simple. And now we see that there's a lot of preparation that goes into it. And when we first read this essay or the lecture, a little bit frightening because he gives a very high bar, and we have to make sure that we don't get too frightened because the nature of an ideal is something to aspire to. It's not something that we can realistically think that, yes, in every respect, that I'll be able to meet that bar. But we have to understand that, first of all, he's talking about the highest class of devotee and the highest level of devotion. Shuddha Bhakti, this pure devotion. This is the title of it. This is pure. If we want to have the really high, perfectly unselfish, pure motiveless type of devotion, then we have to do a lot of this type of preparation. Of course, the main thing is that purifying the heart and giving good ground for us to plant the seeds. Sri Ramakrishna, in a few places, tells the story of Padmalochan. This is actually goes back to a song, a Bengali song, about this village boy, Padmalochan, known as Podo. I'm quoting from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. There lived in a village a young man named Padmalochan. People used to call him Podo for short. In this village, there was a temple in a very dilapidated condition. It contained no image of God. Ashwatha and other plants sprang up on the ruins of its walls. Bats lived inside, and the floor was covered with dust and the droppings of bats. The people of the village had stopped visiting the temple. One day after dusk, the villagers heard the sound of a conch shell from the direction of the temple. They thought perhaps someone had installed an image in the shrine and was performing the evening worship. One of them softly opened the door and saw Padmalochan standing in a corner, blowing the conch. No image had been set up, the temple hadn't been swept or washed, and filth and dirt lay everywhere. Then he shouted to Podo, and this is the Bengali song in English. You have set up no image here within the shrine, O fool. Blowing the conch, you simply make confusion worse confounded. Day and night, 11 bats scream there incessantly. The 11 bats are the 5 organs of action, 5 organs of the senses, and then the mind. That means that we're completely restless and everything. This is the condition of the heart. O Podu, you have no image of Madhava in your temple. And behold, you have not even taken the trouble of cleansing and purifying the temple. Day and night, the 11 bats screech there. Then Sri Ramakrishna explains the whole thing, that we need this certain amount of purity of heart. And I'll get into this a little bit later. We should never think that the heart has to be perfectly pure before we can begin our spiritual practice. This is a great misunderstanding. So the question is, are we willing to go to all of the trouble? Are we willing to pay the price? If somebody tells us that, yes, you can have the highest type of devotion, but you have to pay the price. You have to adjust your life a little bit. You have to be willing to make some sacrifices and make some changes. So this is the point in this lecture where Swami Bhuteshananda, he mentions an incident in the life of Swami Premanand, which I've also mentioned several times. It's a very beautiful little story, a true story, incident. This took place in Malda, and this was towards the end of Swami Premananda's life. He was actually quite ill, and Holy Mother wouldn't allow him to go, and then his health got a little better. She said, oh, okay, you can go. And this was the period where he was infused with this idea of Swamiji's practical Vedanta and serving all living beings as God. So he generally spoke on that topic. So he was speaking about that. And one gentleman in the audience, he kept interrupting. He kept saying, tell us about prema. Tell us about love of God. Okay? So finally, Swami Premanand, he got a little bit annoyed. And he said, you want to hear about prema? And then he tells a story that there was once a feriwala. These feriwalas, they're salesmen. They don't knock door to door. They'll just walk down the street and they'll call out. I remember seeing these carters would do it sometime. The people who go around, if you need any mattress or pillows or something, they'll walk down the street and they'll twang, 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 twang with their, so everyone will know. And if anyone needs it, they'll run out and then they'll hire the person, they'll do it. So these people would go down and they'd be selling something. So here he's going down and said, Prema, I'm selling this divine love. So everyone rushed out and they said, oh, good, we want to buy it. Everybody was anxious to buy it. And then somebody said that, what's the price? And this feriwala, he said that you will have to give your head. Who is ready to give his head in exchange for divine love? And then the Swami says, that day he did not sell even an ounce of divine love. No one was willing to pay the price of their own head. That means to give everything, to sacrifice yourselves completely to God in exchange for prema. So as I say, don't feel that we have to renounce everything, that this is a very high ideal. He's trying to impress the fact that it's not so simple. And it's a question of degree. The more we're willing to surrender and dedicate the whole life, the more we'll make progress in spiritual life. It's very simple. But not everyone is in a position to do that. We have to balance things. Anyhow, so then Swami goes through the different means. So if we say that there's some preparation, what is the preparation? What are the most important things? What do we need before we start this path? Now, you may be wondering, why am I talking about starting the path? Most of us have been on the spiritual path for many, many years. But we're all still beginners. Until we really reach a very high state, we're all kind of beginners. And it's very good for us sometimes to think that we're still in that stage where the preparation is important. It's very dangerous to think that, oh, we're beyond all of that. Now we're very advanced devotees. So he starts out by giving us a few different things. He says, oikantikota. This is that we have to have just completely merged and one with this ideal that we have to really see no other end, eka anta. We have to have no other end in mind. This has to be the most important thing to us. Sarvanta karane, with the full heart, with all the heart and soul. Ananyamana, ananyamana. So the mind can't be divided. It has to be so dedicated to this one spiritual ideal. We have, this is how we have to think of God, meditate on God. At the time when we're doing our spiritual practice, there should be no other thought in our mind. This should be the most important thing in our lives, and we have to do it with all of our heart and soul. A very high bar. And as I say, that we try to do it by degrees, as far as possible for us, that's all. And we make progress little by little. So, the whole mind absorbed in God, literally having one end in view, with all our heart and soul, allowing no other thought to enter the mind. This is how we should feel at the time of meditating on God, of thinking on God. And then he quotes from the Gita, 9th chapter, verse 22, Ananyas chintayantu mam, very famous verse, that those who think of me and none else, whole mind is devoted to me, then I'll take care of all of their needs. Yoga chema vahamyam. They don't have to worry about anything. So he says, how many of us can do that? Can we be that type of devotee that says, I won't bother about even if I get my food the next day or not? That I'm placing my life in the hands of God. He has to take care of me. So as I as I say, it's very difficult, and we shouldn't feel that, oh, I can't do it, I'm not worthy. These are very rare things to reach this type of state. But the point is that we need some tremendous sincere longing. And if you ask me what is the most important thing out of this whole lecture, it's that we have to be sincere. This is the only prerequisite. We have to be sincere, a sincere longing for devotion, and some type of sincere desire also to lead a pure life. Not that we have to consider ourselves pure. Nobody has that perfect purity. We're not born with that. It's a very rare thing. But at least that desire to do it. And then talking about surrender, he says most of us are beggars when it comes to our relationship with God. Always seeking something. And that this is the test. If we don't ask for anything, whatever comes, we're content. We're satisfied with that. He says we ask God to take all responsibility for us, but we don't actually want to surrender ourselves to Him. So the whole question of, we say all of these things, but the whole question of sincerity comes up. And I've often wondered about this sincerity. People sometimes ask, what does it mean to be sincere? It's very difficult to put in words exactly. We can say, if you say something, you mean it, that we're sincere about that. But it's something much deeper. Antarikata, and in Bengali, they say it has to do with the heart itself. It has to be a very deep core belief, something that goes very deep into our very being. So this sincerity, when it comes to leading a spiritual life, to trying to lead a pure life, that there's no fooling around. There's no fooling others, and there's no fooling ourselves. Let there be no theft within the heart. There's a nice Bengali song like that. I remember many, many years ago, this was in 1973, I went to Almora, and there was a place there called Ramakrishna Dham. I'm sure that nobody has ever seen it or anybody ever heard of it. A little place, and surprisingly on that trip, I didn't know about our real ashram. This was the only place that I saw. I was very new to Vedanta in those days. And there was an elderly sadhu there who was American. I was so surprised. And he had been living there his whole life. He must have been, and of course, he seemed very old to me at that time, probably his 70s or 80s. And a very nice man. His name was Mangal Chaitanya. He had been a monk of our order. And he felt that the other monks weren't austere enough. And he left on his own as a brahmachari and spent his whole life there. And he had a handful of people who were devoted to him and helped him. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is that he said over and over again that, but first we must be sincere. That was the only message that he gave. He kept saying over and over again, we must be sincere. So I thought about this so much, and somehow it has to be something that really is deeply heartfelt within us. I don't know any other way to explain it. We call on God with all our heart and soul. Sarvanta karane, with all our heart and soul. And ananyamana, that's the mind that care for anything else at that time. So then Swami Bhuteshananda, when he mentions faith, devotion, and surrender. These are elements that have to be there on the path of devotion to some extent. As I say, everything, as we practice, we get better at all of these things. Surrender means we're content with whatever comes to us after putting forth effort. Another mistake that we often make. The surrender means I won't try for anything. Whatever God gives me, it's okay. It doesn't mean that. We only have to look at Thakur's story of the bird on the mast of the ship. The bird flies with all of its effort as far as it can possibly fly, looking for land, until it doesn't find it and it comes back. Even then, it doesn't give up self-effort. It has to do it 4 times, go in every direction looking for land. Only after that, it can say, now, wherever the ship takes me, I'll be content. So that type of surrender and contentment doesn't come until we've exhausted all of our energy. So we have to be able to do that. And then contentment means with the results. We'll still do our best, do our purushakara. We'll still put forth all of our energy and effort. But whatever comes, then we're content with that. Then we practice surrender that way. Then, of course, he talked about purity of heart. So the first thing we can say is this sincerity. Sincerity, humility, or shraddha in a single word. Then he talks about purity of heart. And we hear this wonderful parable that Sri Ramakrishna used to tell. There was a king in a small kingdom who wanted to see how the subjects in his kingdom lived. So he sent his ministers out, you find one simple family, and I'll come and I'll visit them. And he said, but first, you go and make sure the preparations are made. He didn't want to embarrass them. So he said, you go send a little team there, have them go in and clean out the house and to make sure everything is spick and span. Bring in a little table and some chairs so when I come, they can invite me to sit down and have a nice little tea set. So when I come, they can serve me nicely. So the ministers, they did all of that. Everyone's looking around and thinking, oh, now some wonderful guest will be coming. And then the king comes. So Thakur says that, yeah, we have to clean everything top to bottom. That means cleanse the heart. And then we bring in all these other little things. This will be viveka, vairagya, all of our discrimination, dispassion, shraddha, all of the virtues that we know. And now we can say, well, God dwells within the heart already. That's true. But we want to feel as if we're bringing God into the heart. Later we'll understand, of course, God is always there. But if we want to feel that we've made a proper place for God to reside and for us to serve him there. Now, what happens if we go ahead with our spiritual practices without at least attempting to purify the heart? And again, we have some nice parables here. Sri Ramakrishna talks about the farmers who try to irrigate their fields. I'd like to do a study one day. There must be at least a dozen different examples that Thakur uses with regard to farmers and irrigating the field, with all slightly different interpretation, different points that he's making. This particular one, he says that the farmers, they go to a lot of trouble to make the canal, the side of the canal on the side, they take the clay and they build it up, and they have to make ridges there so that the water will flow in between the ridges. And he says, but in certain places, if they don't do it correctly, the little holes will come. And then when the water is released from the reservoir and starts coming down the channel, it all leaks through the different holes so that none of the water gets to the field. And he says these holes are desires. These desires and impurities that we have, that doesn't allow the water to get to the field. Now, what is our condition? Our condition is that some water will leak out, but some will get to the field. We're not the best, we're not the worst. We'll be somewhere in between, but we're trying to maximize. This is the point of the whole thing. How to block the holes. Swami Bhuteshananda says, we can do this by purifying the mind. How? By performing only good deeds. So we shouldn't think, oh, how do I purify the mind? The mind is full of strange thoughts and ideas that I'm not very happy with. He says, by performing only good deeds. So behavior is the main thing. We change the way we live in the world, and that will change the nature of our personality and mind. Avoiding overindulgence in sense pleasures. We have to lead a simple life. These are sacrifices that we make. We may have to change the type of people that we spend time with and the types of things that we're used to doing, parties, things like that, if we're serious. And trying to concentrate the mind on God. The real preparation is hearing and thinking about God with great concentration. So spiritual practice, sadhana. We have to do the sadhana. This is that funny type of relationship. We want purity in order to do sadhana, but we do sadhana in order to get purity. So we have to kind of do these things together. If we say that we're not fit to do any of these practices because the heart is not pure enough, we're completely missing the point. Completely missing the point. We do these things in order to purify the heart. I remember reading about a statement that Swami Ashokanandaji made. He, of course, was the head of our San Francisco Center, a very brilliant, wonderful speaker, wonderful Swami, that one of the devotees hadn't come for a while. And he said, why haven't you been coming? And he said, I've felt all these impure thoughts and everything coming to the mind. I didn't feel pure enough to come. And he said, this is exactly the wrong reasoning. He said, will you stay away from the fire when you're feeling cold? That's a very nice idea, huh? At the very time you have to come near the fire. When we're feeling that, oh, I'm not qualified, I'm not capable, that the heart is not pure enough, that's when we need holy company. That's when we need to do our spiritual practice. A very wonderful teaching. So the sadhana is for purification of the mind and the heart, not to be done only after we've purified it. Now there's a second illustration that Thakur gives. This is also very nice, that there were some friends who had been out drinking one night, and they got drunk. And they thought, oh, let's take a little trip. We'll get into this rowboat, and we'll cross the river, go to the other side. So they get in the rowboat. It's dark out. And they're rowing all night long, till the sun comes up. And they say they haven't gotten anywhere. So then one of them looks and says, we forgot to raise the anchor. So Thakur says that all of our effort goes in vain if we don't raise that anchor. That means that we don't get rid of some of our attachments and desires and things like that. Chaitanya Deva, the great teacher of avatar of bhakti, Thakur called him the avatar of divine love. After he had his conversion, before he was a very proud Sanskrit scholar, very proud. Everyone was scared of him. All the other pundits, when they would come, he would find mistakes in their grammar and make fun of them and everything, and a very proud scholar. Then he kind of completely changed. And after he had this kind of conversion, he never wrote anything. He never wrote any philosophical text, anything like that. He was perfectly capable of doing it. But he had this one hymn that he wrote. And all of our Southern California centers, we recite this every morning, the English translation. I think it was Swami Prabhupada and Christopher Isherwood who translated that. The Sanskrit is very, very well known. This Taranadapi Sunichena, Tarorapi Sahishnuna, Amanina Manadena, Kirtaniya Sadahari. And the English translation is very nice, but it misses a very subtle little point. It says, be humbler than a blade of grass, be patient and forbearing like the tree. Give honor to all, take honor from none. Chant unceasingly the name of the Lord. Now this Kirtaniya, it really means the name Kirtaniya Sadhari. So who is qualified to chant the name of the Lord? It is to be done by a certain type of person. So what this is really saying, if we want to really be perfectly qualified to follow this path of devotion, we're adding a couple of things here. There's humility. And of course, this all falls within Shraddha. There's humility, and like the blade of grass, that people walk on it, it doesn't mind. That type of humility. And patience like the tree. The little kids will climb on it, people will cut its branches, they'll do all sorts of things. Doesn't say a word. And then amanina. We don't care if anybody praises us or shows us respect at all, but we'll be manada, we'll give honor to all. Such a person is qualified to follow this path of devotion. A very beautiful idea. Kirtaniya sada harihi. So really, in one word, is Shraddha. This Shraddha is the one thing that's emphasized in Gita more than anything else. More than anything else. If we really analyze it carefully, we find that the only people who are kind of debarred from this path of devotion are those who are devoid of Shraddha. That Sri Krishna says that they shouldn't even hear these teachings. It'll be a waste of time. And if they make fun of them, it will be very bad for them. So the Shraddha includes, sometimes we say Shraddha simply means faith, but this humility is a part of it. This sincerity is part of it. This forbearance is part of it. The faith, of course, is part of it. So these are all things that are within our grasp. We may say purity of heart, is far from that. That I won't pretend to have this perfect purity of heart. But I can say that, yes, I have that humility. I know that I know that I'm not the greatest of spiritual seekers. I know that I have all of my impurities. I know that there's so many people more advanced, and we can all do that. That's simple. That's easy. There's forbearance. We can learn that. We go through life, and so many things come to us. After a while, we say, yes, I know that these things will come. I have to have patience. They come and they go. We learn these lessons throughout our life. And then, why should we care what other people think of us? And yet, we'll show respect to everyone else. We don't lose anything by that. So we can do all of these things. This is within the realm. These are all within the realm of our spiritual practice. So this Shraddha, if we have this humility, this faith, this reverence for the teachings and everything, this is enough. Now, Swami Bhuteshananda, he makes a very interesting statement, gives us another piece of advice, which when I first read it, seemed not out of place, but it wasn't exactly what I was expecting. He starts talking about selflessness, leading an unselfish type of life. He gives great emphasis to that, because selfishness is one of the great obstacles to real devotion. He says, we won't be able to love God till we become unselfish. We don't always make that connection. That what has it got to do with how I deal with other people? That how does that loving God is loving God? But he says we won't be able to love God until we become unselfish. This may not be possible in the beginning, but as we progress, we can become more and more unselfish. This is with all of these virtues. We don't have to have them all in the beginning. As we go along, we get these more and more. Devotion and selfishness are like light and darkness. They can never go together. Now, why should this be? If we analyze, why do we do selfish things? First of all, there's this feeling of I, this I-ness, this false identification, that I am someone separate, and I want to enjoy things, and I don't care about the other person, so they're based on ignorance. And it's a wrong understanding of our nature, and it leads to pride and to jealousy and anger and all sorts of things which block devotion. So really this ego, selfishness is based on the ego. The ego is the main obstacle in all spiritual paths. But this path of devotion in this sense of pride and this sense of wanting things for ourselves, selfishness. And this is something, of course, Swamiji emphasizes this so much, even to the point of saying that unselfishness is God, that this is for him, this was one of the greatest things. He couldn't bear this idea of being selfish, even seeking our own liberation. He said, work for the liberation of others. Don't worry about your own liberation, it'll come. Lead a perfectly unselfish life. Now I want to go back to the title of this talk that he gave, why he gave this title. The first part, Shuddha Bhakti Lakhan. Okay, that's fine. We want to know all of the characteristics and qualities of pure devotion. But the second part, Tar Praptir Upai, the means of attaining it. So we have two things here. We can talk about the means of attaining devotion and the characteristics of the real devotee. What's the connection? Connection is that if we know the characteristics, that becomes our spiritual practice in order to attain. That becomes the upai. That becomes the means. This is what Swamiji means when he says that the means and the ends be one. We find this theme throughout the Gita. We have different sections, chapter 2, Sthita Prajna section, that Shankaracharya makes a very strong point that we're not simply giving the characteristics of this sage of steady wisdom, Sthita Prajna. We're not giving these characteristics just so we'll stand in awe and say, how wonderful. Huh? There's somebody who's perfectly content within the self and unmoved and no ups and downs, the same, and pleasure and pain, all of that. It's not just to say how wonderful that is. If we want to become a Sthita Prajna, then this is the roadmap. Then we practice these things. If the Sthita Prajna is able to withdraw the mind, they give the illustration of the tortoise, that if the tortoise is afraid of something, you can pull in the head and pull in the four legs inside the shell. That means that in meditation can withdraw the mind and the senses. If we want to be like that, then we practice it. That is the upai. So the lakhan, the lakshana, and the upai become one and the same. The means and the end become one and the same. We find this in chapter 12 of the Bhakti Yoga of the Gita, with the characteristics of the ideal devotee. We find it in chapter 14, the characteristics of someone who is gunatita, someone who's transcended the three gunas. They're meant for practice, for sadhana. A very important point that Shankaracharya emphasizes. So we see that in this chapter 12 especially, the chapter 12 of the Gita is very, very commonly studied, but the final portion is often overlooked a little bit, I think. This chapter 12 can be divided into different sections. That one section, in the beginning, is about the path of worshiping God as infinite absolute reality or a personal God. And then after that, we talk about different spiritual practices. And then the third part is, what are the characteristics? And Sri Krishna puts it in a different way. He says, who is dear to me? Who pleases me the most? Now we would think, the person who is singing and dancing and weeping and calling on God all the time is pleasing God the most. But no, it's very interesting. When we look at the characteristics of the ideal bhakta, ideal devotee, we find they're the same as the characteristics of the Sthita Prajna. And is a gunatita purusha, the person beyond the three gunas. So this is a very important concept that Thakur talks about. He uses this term aropkara. He says that we have to kind of assume these. This is that idea of imitation. We see a great soul, how they live in the world. We want to become like that, then we try to act like that. They become role models for us. And we try to put into practice these things. And this aropkara is a little artificial in the beginning. It's role-playing. Say, even in the path of Jnana Yoga, that we start out by saying, yes, I'm perfect, I'm ever free, nothing can bind me. In the beginning, we may not even believe it. We may sort of understand it and everything, but we're superimposing that. We're doing it to counteract this idea that I'm a poor bound soul and everything. And we find after a while that it helps us realize that it was always true. It was always true. So if I say now that, yes, the heart is ever pure and perfect, I can hardly do it with a straight face, but I know the meaning behind it. And if I think like that, and then every time I want to do something that I shouldn't do, I'm reminded of that, then it changes my behavior. And his behavior, remember he said, how do we get this purification of heart? By behaving in that way. So I like this, the end of this chapter very much, chapter 12, verses 13 through 20. I'll go through it very briefly, but I encourage everyone to read it. And read it as really a roadmap. This is exactly telling us what we have to do ourselves. And not to say, how wonderful. If only I could be like that. It's not if only I could be like that. It's telling us how to be like that. We try to put these things into practice. So, this section, it begins with friendly and compassionate to all beings. This we can all do. And as I say, these are not the first things that come to mind when we talk about what are the characteristics of the greatest devotee of God. So we have to rethink these things a little bit. Friendly and compassionate to all beings, free from I and mine. So that selflessness, free from I and mine, the same in pain and pleasure, forbearing, ever content, with the mind fixed on God. Okay, mind fixed on God, that's okay. But we have to remember this forbearance and the same-sightedness, and not being moved by things, not having lots of ups and downs. Now, it's true, in the path of devotion, there can be tremendous ups and downs. With the look at the life of Chaitanya Deva, and we see it was like a yo-yo, up and down, up and down. Viraha bhava, milana bhava, the feeling separate from Krishna, feeling union with Krishna, back and forth. There's one type of devotion, the devotional path in Gita, a little bit smoother type of path. And really requires us to not have too much of these highs and lows, to try to be even-keeled in life, to be calm and peaceful. The same in pain and pleasure. Forbearing, ever content, with the mind fixed on God. Then, not disturbed by the world and not disturbing the world. So, because we have to analyze these things, why do we want to do anything to disturb anybody? It all goes back to ego, something within me, either for some selfish desire, or I like to see other people disturbed, or something like that. And why should I let whatever anybody else does disturb me? This is a choice that we make. The choice that we make. Somebody says something, and do I get insulted? If I let myself get insulted, I'll get insulted. I always like this idea that nobody can insult someone unless they get insulted. Yeah? No matter what they say. What a horrible person you are. How ugly you are. How mean you are. How nasty you are. You say, yes, you're right. I understand. I do. I'm not a perfect person. Thank you. Yeah. Then, did we get insulted? No. The person may have tried to insult us. We have to participate in these things. So, this is not being disturbed by the world, because the world will always throw different things at us. They have every opportunity to get upset, and every opportunity to upset other people. So we avoid these things. The same to friend and foe. These are very difficult things. The same-sightedness. See the same God dwelling within all beings. Now, it doesn't mean that we embrace the enemy. Thakur is very clear on this. Some people we salute from a distance, that's all. We don't mix with them, but we, in some of the scriptures, they'll say that not too much attached to those that we love, and with those who we don't love or who are enemies to us, indifference, not hatred. Indifference means that we won't let them disturb us and we won't mix with them too freely. But from a distance, we'll see, yes, God also dwells within them. Then content with what comes of its own. We talked about this contentment. What comes of its own after we do it, at least the minimum amount of effort. This can really turn into a very Thomasic idea if we think that it means that I just sit and don't do anything, and that God will provide for me. Only the very highest level, the highest type of sadhu, who will say, no, I won't even bake my food today. If it comes, it comes. I'm relying wholly on God. Otherwise, it's laziness. We don't want to do anything. And he says in this lecture, another lecture, no, I read it, Swami Parameshananda Maharaj. He said, we always talk about this Kopala Lekha and Allah's Hukum. It's not my fate. Not the will of God. He said, who knows what the will of God is? You try and do something, he says. If it doesn't happen, then you can say, okay, it wasn't meant to be. That's all. But try to do something. So, content, that means after we try to do something, whatever comes, we accept it. And we don't make too much of an effort. We don't go overboard. We understand that a simple life is a better type of life. Then finally, a willingness to follow these teachings in our lives with humility and faith, and looking upon the spiritual goal as the one goal of life. So, let me sum up things a little bit here. What are the main prerequisites? Prastuti. What are the main preparations for having a heart of devotion? That means we're serious. We really, we want to love God. We don't know what it means exactly, but we want to love God. And first thing is sincerity. We have to be sincere to the core. Sincerity, this is all this Shraddha. Sincerity, humility, faith, devotion. The sincere desire to lead a spiritual life. We don't have to be perfect at the very beginning. This is the minimum amount of weeding and preparation. Then we can start, and we know that we're going to have to continue, that the weeds will come back until we get them by the root. It'll be a long process. We'll think that we got them out, and we'll see, no, they come back. And then one day we really say, no, I'm going to pull it by the roots and get everything. And so little by little we keep doing it. We keep watering. We have to. So it's a continuum. It's a work in progress, this purification. So this first thing is the sincerity, then this purification. And this idea that at least we have a minimum of purity of heart. At least enough that says, I have a desire to lead a pure life. That's enough. That's enough. And then we just, we continue with that. And as we do our practice, this purification comes. It comes as a result of our practice. The illustration that Sri Ramakrishna gives about dyeing the cloth is very, very helpful for us. We all say that, yes, unless the cloth is perfectly pure and white, it won't take the color. It won't take the dye very well. If it's stained, then you dip it in with the stains, that doesn't take the dye, that part. And so we think that first we have to purify the heart, then we can think of God. Thakur says, no, the mind is like a piece of cloth that had just come back from the laundry. Now we say, how is that possible? My mind is not like that. But his point is, feel that the mind is like that, so that when you dip it in the thought of God, it'll take that color. And his point is really that how do we make it by dipping it into that dye that not only colors the mind with God, but purifies it also. So they work hand in hand. We want a little purity to begin with, but we can't wait. There's a very nice verse that Swami Vivekananda quotes about the fool who won't go take a bath in the ocean until all the waves subside. We can't do that. Sometimes we plunge in. So with this purity of heart, it's like that also. Okay, I know that my heart is not perfectly pure. I know I have my desires and everything. It's not going to prevent me from leading a spiritual life. It's going to impel me. It's going to inspire me to do everything possible for this purification of heart, which will come automatically through our spiritual practice. So the best way to attain this pure heart is through our spiritual practice, and it's a lifelong challenge. And we know that one of the greatest aids in this is holy company. Now, why holy company? Because here we see the living embodiment of Stita Prajna, of the ideal bhakta, of the Gunatita, the Purusha, the person beyond all. We see it. And this is the easiest. Sorry. Because there's a kind of unconscious transfer that takes place. If we have that appreciation and we see what a wonderful type of life it is to live that way, and how much joy they get from it, and how much peace they have from it, then naturally we'll try to emulate it and be a very natural type of thing. So this is why Thakur always emphasizes that so much. Then, of course, that last factor that Swami Bhuteshananda Maharaj talks about, this unselfishness. And as I said before, that this is because that ego is the biggest obstacle in spiritual life, in all paths of spiritual life. Let me quote from the very final words of Swami Bhuteshananda. If we can only become completely unselfish, we will have no reason to fear. Our selfishness will decrease in proportion to the increase in our devotion to God. Our selfishness will decrease in proportion. See how these things work together. He could also say our devotion to God will increase in proportion to our lack of selfishness. They work together. Our selfishness will decrease in proportion to the increase in our devotion to God. A true devotee will serve all living beings, knowing that it is God who resides within each of them. Then he quotes from Gita 6:30. Yomam pashyati sarvatra sarvam chamai pashyati tasyaham na pranashyami sachamena pranashyati. He who sees me everywhere and sees everything in me, to that devotee I am never lost, nor is he ever lost to me. And then he finishes, God will always be near such a devotee, holding his hand and protecting him from danger. So we have to understand that this path of devotion is really a very natural, simple thing, but it requires some preparation. And we shouldn't take it for granted. We should be very serious. But if we're sincere, this is the main thing. That whoever has that sincerity and that shraddha, the path is open. There's nothing else required. It's a very wonderful, hopeful type of teaching. Forget about all this stuff about the very high bar. We have to be perfect, perfectly pure and everything. It is a work in progress, and it's something that we can all do. So let me close here. Om sarve bhavantu sukhina, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet. Om Shanti, 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. May all beings be happy. May all be free from disease. May all realize only good things in their lives. May no one suffer from misery. Om peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thank you, everyone. Next Sunday, the lecture will be just a YouTube lecture. Swami Chidbrahmananji, he's still in California. Kumar? His talk next Sunday. Yeah. I don't remember the title, but you'll be able to see that go to our website and click on that, and you'll be able to see it. So thank you all for coming. Everyone, please stay well and see you next time.